Okay, good. Thank you very much for that kind of introduction and for the invitation to speak to you here today on the topic of climate change and climate modeling. I've had to compete for airtime over the course of my career with many big names, never any as big as the Super Bowl. So I'm happy to see so many people here today, and we'll try and make it an interesting competition. It's very nice to be back here at the University of Toronto as well. I spent 5 great years here as a researcher. Unfortunately, there'll be no Beyonce halftime show in my talk, but it will be in 2 halves. That's the one thing I share in common with the Super Bowl. So the first half of my talk, I would like to describe a little bit about what these climate models are that we keep hearing so much about in the media. And in the second half, I'd like to tell a bit more of an in-depth story of my own research area and how we're trying to improve models and the science that goes along with doing that. And I welcome your comments and feedback at the end. The story begins, though, with observations rather than with models, and it's observations of climate that I'm sure we're becoming quite familiar with by now. The temperature, globally averaged, annually averaged, of Earth has been warming with a few bumps and wiggles fairly continuously since the pre-industrial period, which we define as the sort of mid to late 1800s. As shown by the image at the upper left of the screen here. The warming, when observed at different locations across the Earth's surface, as demonstrated by the picture on the right, these figures are from the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The warming is observed in almost all locations on Earth, and that is consistent with the idea that carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, are responsible for some of this warming. And I'll get to that a bit more in a moment. If, however, you are an interested skeptic and you might say that, well, you know, thermometers have been located too close to airports and development has occurred since the 1800s and these instrumental records are biased. Perhaps the sea surface temperatures that are measured by the intake of water into ships' hulls have been affected by changes in the technology. Well, there's evidence from many different lines, many different indicators that are consistent with the idea that the climate is warming. So the downward trend in snow cover over the northern hemisphere, a similar and dramatic downward trend in the spatial extent of sea ice over the northern Arctic Ocean, the increase in heat content of the upper 500 to 800 meters of ocean globally, and the somewhat inexorable rise of sea level that have been detected first by tidal gauges and more recently by satellite instruments. So there's multiple lines of evidence that support the idea that the climate is warming. This would go down as what we refer to in the field as detection of climate change. So in many different areas, we've detected the signal of climate change. This tells us nothing about what's causing the climate to change. And it turns out that for that, you really need climate models. You need a good theory, and you need to use climate models to help you to do what's called attribute or do attribution exercises to tell us what the cause of this warming trend and the changes in climate that we've observed is. So the first use for climate models in my sort of motivation section here is to do attribution. It's to understand past data, the past changes in climate. And climate models are very useful for this because in the model world, we can simulate the climate of the late 1800s and the 20th century under different conditions and with different forcing conditions. And only when we take into account both natural forces of climate, things like changes in solar radiation, volcanic eruptions, only when we take those factors into account and the presence of anthropogenically caused changes to greenhouse gases and aerosols, only when we take all of that into account can we reproduce the observed change in global mean surface temperature and now in other climate variables as well. So the image at the upper left here, the blue shaded region shows you the temperature change over the 20th century from climate models forced only by those natural forcing factors. And the purple or pink, lines here, pink shaded region, shows you the results from climate models forced by natural and anthropogenic changes. And the black line shows you our estimate of the observed warming. So only when we include the natural and the anthropogenic factors in models can we reproduce the observed trend. This is a very powerful use of models to understand past data, understand changes that have been observed. And this attribution part of the problem is a really big plus for using models. The second use, of course, and one that we're probably a bit more familiar with, is to look forward, to peer into the future, to use models as tools for prediction and projection. And I'll explain a bit more about the difference between those two terms later on. But looking forward, so here's a reproduction of something similar to what we just saw. It's the global mean surface temperature between 1950 and 2005 from a large number of different climate models. And here are some projections of where that quantity could go over the next 100 years, out to 2100. And so we have a red line here, and the solid line represents the average of a large number of different model simulations. And similarly, the blue line is the average of a large number of model simulations. The difference between the red and the blue line is in the path, the emissions trajectory that these models have been subjected to. So it's a question of whether or not we emit more, that's the red, or less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over the next 100 years as to which of those trajectories will follow. Clearly, there is some variation around the solid line. That's the shaded region in each case. That shows us that we don't know precisely where in the red or blue cones we will end up. But we know with a high degree of certainty that all of these red or orange simulations are different from all of these blue simulations. So it really does matter which emissions trajectory we follow by the end of century. So models as tools for projection and prediction are very useful. But this is a global average quantity, global mean surface temperature. It turns out you don't really need a climate model to make at least crude predictions of what carbon dioxide increase will do to global mean surface temperature. But where the power of climate models comes in is the ability to resolve not just the global average, but also the regional, the spatially resolved structures of change. So these maps are again taken from the most recent IPCC report, and the top two panels show you end of 21st century projections for surface temperature change relative to the modern climate, the present climate, in this is the low greenhouse gas emission, and this is the high greenhouse gas emission scenario. And so we can see what the temperature change will look like in different regions of the globe. And things that are predicted by theory, for example, more warming towards the poles than in the equatorial region, more warming over land than over ocean. These are things that the global climate models can pick up. And similarly, on the bottom, we have now a different variable. This is now precipitation. So with warm colors showing us areas that will dry, the blues and greens showing us areas that will become wetter under climate change. So the power of climate models is they're able to simulate the full suite of variables in the climate system, and they're able to resolve those quantities spatially, so we can get a complete picture of what climate change might look like under these different emission scenarios. So to sort of sum up my motivation, my introductory part here, I would argue that climate models are an absolutely integral part of the study and understanding of climate change. And that goes for the understanding of past observations, and also for forming and making projections of what the future climate will look like. Human activities have, using models, been demonstrably shown to explain a large amount of the warming that we've observed since 1850. And similarly, model projections, as we've just seen, suggest that if we don't modify the rate of emissions, if we continue these activities forward into the 21st century, then the warming will continue, and we can describe, using the model results, the response in different quantities, different parameters like precipitation, for example. So all of this then, this emphasis on climate models, really begs the question, well, what is a climate model? And you know, we focus a lot on results from models, but we don't necessarily, in this type of forum, I think, present as climate scientists, you know, what is a model? How is a model formed? How can they be used? What are the advantages, disadvantages, that kind of thing. So I want to focus in the first part on some of those questions. And I won't be able to cover everything, and I hope that in the discussion there'll be some back and forth and we can fill in some of the gaps. So I thought about different ways to describe what a climate model is in a means that was kind of friendly for a slide and for a lecture. And one way is to sort of build a conceptual picture of what the model would look like if I was to construct one here on the stage, right? Clearly these models are computer programs and they exist in a software code, right, and run on a supercomputer. But if I was to build a model, it would look like a bit like this. It would be comprised of a sphere that had towers of boxes, right? And the boxes are filled with stuff, and I'll say in a minute what the stuff is. The computer model, at its most kind of basic function, level of function, is really a stuff tracking algorithm, right? And it tracks the movement of things between boxes. And so the towers of boxes extend from the surface of the sphere up to the top, the nominal top of the atmosphere in the model. So these are three-dimensional boxes, and we've divided the globe up into a certain number of these boxes, right? That's the starting point for the model. So you can see the surface of the globe here. There's a grid, there's a mesh, and at each grid box location, there's a tower of boxes that extends up into the sky. If that location is over ocean, there's also a tower of boxes that extends down below the surface because the ocean circulation is represented as well. So the simplest way to think about this climate model is as a stuff tracking machine. So what's the stuff? Well, these boxes, if you think about the atmosphere, the boxes are just full of air, really, right? And warm, moist air at that. So, but there's other stuff in there too, right? And there's properties of the boxes that we'd like to keep track of. And that's what the climate model does. So energy, right? Flows of energy, flows of momentum, water, right, in its three phases can be present in any of the boxes. Greenhouse gases, ozone, pollution particles like aerosol particles. There can also be geochemical and vegetation processes if the box is over land. Many different types. There's an et cetera on here to sort of represent the fact that there's lots and lots of things I haven't included on here. But the point is that the model keeps track of the movement and flows of this stuff from box to box, right? So if there's a wind blowing, then it's blowing from one box through another into another, and the model has to calculate at every time interval how much stuff is in box A, how much is leaving, what the flow or flux of the quantity is into box B. All of those calculations are undertaken by the software every 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes. And a simulation of climate can last for 100 years or more. So there's an enormous number of calculations, and this is what demands a supercomputer, to keep track of all of the stuff that's moving around. And so the climate simulation begins from an initial state of the weather, say today's weather observed globally, and then the model is integrated forward on these 15, 20-minute time steps. At each time step, we're calculating what's happened to all of the stuff and updating the contents of each of the grid boxes, and then we're moving on to the next time step. And we accumulate a history or a record of the stuff being moved through time, and that forms the contents of the climate simulation. And then the end point is where all the stuff has ended up, or what the temperature has risen to over 100 years, etc. So it's important to say what these models are not. They're not statistical models that are built using statistical relationships formed on past data. These are models, these are dynamical models that have at their core a set of governing equations that relate to the flows of energy, of momentum between the boxes. So these are forward models. But as you will have noticed from the diagram before, the boxes are quite big in terms of space. The boxes in a typical climate model in the current generation tend to have sides that are about between 50 and 100 kilometers long. So that's pretty big. That's from here to Barrie, perhaps, right, in southern Ontario. That could be one side of a box. So there's a lot of physics that can happen on scales that are smaller than that. There's a lot of physics that goes on in the atmosphere that is considerably more complex than we would like to include in a model, or that we can afford to include because of computational costs. Some of those processes are summarized on this diagram. Anything that we cannot explicitly resolve in a model, we refer to as an unresolved process. It typically is included in the model with a simplification or an approximation, and that's known as the process of parameterization. So some of the processes which have to be parameterized in a climate model, typically things involving clouds, which can occur on very small, sort of millimeter to centimeter type spatial scales. Those things would be parameterized rather than resolved. We do now have a class of climate models which are cloud resolving. They are quite some way away from being included in these century-long global climate simulations of which I'm talking about. So we have resolved processes for which we have governing equations, and then we have a whole series of unresolved processes, which are the small-scale processes that can feed back onto the larger scale and interact with the larger scale, that must also be included. And it turns out that most of the research, most of the science that's being done, including that in my group, pertains to this parameterization area. We're most interested in that. The governing equations of motion, conservation of mass and energy, those things for the physicists in the room, the Navier-Stokes equations have been known and solvable for a long time, right? But the real sort of bleeding edge of model development tends to happen in this area of parameterization. It's improving the representation of processes that are not explicitly resolved. Okay. So I'm going to show a few cartoons of what climate models might look like. The bubbles here in this diagram, this is the structure of what we like to refer to as an Earth system model, and I'll get to that point in a moment. The bubbles represent the different modules, and each of the different components of the climate system tends to have its own module in the computer code. And each of the modules is its own dynamical model, and it can function independently, which I'll mention in a moment. The atmosphere, the atmospheric general circulation model, usually the biggest component of a fully fledged climate model. The ocean, down here, there's a dynamical model for the ocean. There's one for the land surface as well, dealing with hydrology, surface temperature, reflectivity. And then parts of the land ice and also the sea ice have their own interactive dynamical models. The arrows on this diagram indicate interactions or exchange of fluxes, information, between different components. So the purple arrows show which components the atmosphere is influencing, right? So there's an influence of the atmosphere, and it goes, well, not surprisingly, to everything, right? It goes to the land ice, to the land, the ocean, and the sea ice. But the sea ice doesn't interact with the land ice, right? Those two things are separate because they're not directly connected. So this is how a model is what we call coupled together. Different component models are coupled together, and there is a program typically called a coupler. And it takes the fluxes from one component and sends them off to the other, kind of does some translation with grids and fancy things normally. But it's really the nerve center. It makes sure that we're keeping track of the movement of stuff between the different component models. As I mentioned, each of these components is its own model. Right? So the atmosphere is a standalone, what used to be called a general circulation model. Okay? And it's possible, in fact, it's highly common for us to run, for climate scientists to run these models independently in what's called when we decouple the models from each other. So these are decoupled simulations. It can be advantageous to do this if you want to isolate the influence of one particular process or set of processes on another. So for example, there may not be any need to run a simulation with a fully fledged dynamical ocean model that can simulate all of the overturning currents and patterns of variability in the ocean. It may be sufficient if what you're interested in is a particular signature of atmospheric variability or change. It may be sufficient to just show the atmosphere a picture of what the ocean surface looks like. So we've replaced all of that complex computation that was done by the ocean model with a picture that updates in time, but it's very, very much simpler. It just shows the model what the surface of the ocean looks like. So these decoupled simulations are very useful. We run a lot of simulations like this, and you can actually do a lot of really good science by simplifying the problem. And it's much easier to do a controlled experiment when you have fewer things that are changing all at the same time. So this is a very powerful property of these climate models, is that they can easily be they're modular, and they can easily be switched. Components can easily be switched on or off. This is a figure that shows something about the evolution of climate models into what we do now refer to as Earth system models. And the reason for that is that these models have evolved to be much more than just numerical representations of the climate system. You'll see, so this is now the progression over time from the mid-1960s when the science of numerical solutions to numerical weather prediction and the atmospheric general circulation became commonplace. And we also had, at that time, fairly crude, but still dynamical model representations of the ocean circulation as well. At this point, they weren't really properly coupled together. That didn't happen for another decade or so. But you can see as the passage of time goes on, and still here we're already 5-6 years down the road, more and more processes have been included and are now represented in these models. In the most recent versions, we see dynamical ice sheet models, we see biogeochemical models, we see vegetation on the land that is able to respond to climate changes. These are now much more than just pure climate models in the sense that we understood them to be in the 70s and 80s. These really now are Earth system models, and they continue to evolve, and more processes are being included. It may surprise some of you, it likely won't surprise all of you, but to learn that there's not just one climate model, right? So climate models evolved from numerical weather prediction models. And numerical weather prediction has always been something that has been undertaken by government labs. So we can think of Environment Canada in this country, we can think of NOAA in the United States, the Met Office in the UK. These are large government laboratories that have developed software over these many decades that is used primarily for numerical weather prediction. And I'll show a slide in a moment that suggests that those models have gotten really good at doing that. Numerical weather prediction skill is really amazing these days, contrary to what sometimes gets believed or presented. But it may surprise some of you to learn that there's really a family of climate models that exist currently. And I've just tried to bullet on here where some of the major modeling centers are in the world that are contributing climate models to international coordinated projects on climate modeling. And really we do have access to an amazing array of data from these models. Because there's a family of models, we've actually been able to determine a family tree of climate models. This is for the sort of previous generation of climate models, but it's interesting and also informative to to see which of these different climate models is related to one another, right? Because we'd like to know how independent these models are from one another. And so this exercise has been undertaken, but we should be aware that there are this large number, depending on how we define what an independent climate model is, there's between sort of 15 and 25 climate models around the world producing data, submitting it to archives, and having climate scientists look at the output. So this is really a kind of golden age for climate modeling, as it were. Models are simplifications, approximations, so can we trust them, right? This is the sort of big question. Can we believe what a computer model is telling us about climate 100 years from now? That's really a fundamental question. And I would argue that to a large extent we can. Some of the details we need to take care with interpreting, but generally for the large scale, global average surface temperature for certain, these models have should be viewed with a very high degree of confidence. There are many ways that we evaluate climate models and validate climate models. One is that we can use these models to simulate and examine past climate data. As I said, the first and foremost use for these models is not forward prediction, it's for understanding the climate of the past. And so what can be done is to run a simulation of a model and then compare its output with available observational data. And that is the sort of gold standard of model evaluation. And at all of those government labs that I just showed you, these kind of quality control or model validation procedures are just part of the daily activity. So model development goes on in the individual component groups, the atmosphere, the land, the ocean, and changes that are made to the model. There's a sort of ethos of first do no harm, right? So we don't want to make a change to a model that's going to degrade the simulation. So we have a reference, we have an existing version of a model, we improve something, make a change to one of the components. How does it change the simulation of, for example, in this case, summertime precipitation over the Indian subcontinent, right? The monsoon circulation. Here's an example where we have some observational data here in the upper left corner, and a previous version of a climate model. It's called the Community Atmosphere Model version 4. And it was run with grid spacing. The sides of those grid boxes were about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. This is the simulated precipitation field from that previous version of the model. Below it is the simulated precipitation field from an improved version of the model, right? The grid spacing has been reduced. It's now 25 kilometers, right? So we've increased the resolution. And it's pretty clear to see that when you increase the resolution of this model, you improve its simulation of monsoon precipitation, right? There's a very much more marked center of high precipitation along this western coastal region of India that is present in the observed precipitation record, but is very much more blurred and poorly simulated in the lower resolution model. So here's an example of a validation exercise where we compare our model simulation with observations. And that can go on for all different parts of the simulation. I just want to say something briefly about projection and prediction. So climate models evolved from numerical weather prediction models. Those models are used for weather prediction. We make predictions of whether or not it's going to rain in Toronto next Sunday, okay? Climate modeling is not so much interested with prediction. It's not really interested in whether or not it's going to rain on February 5th in Toronto in 100 years' time. I'll explain a little bit more about that. But numerical weather prediction is what's known as an initial value problem. Climate modeling is what's known as a boundary forcing problem. Those terms are a little bit technical. So borrowing some great analogies used by a colleague here at the U of T, Steve Easterbrook, the initial value problem is like the teacher who sees a group of naughty students somewhere in the middle of the class talking or using cell phones. And in the era that I went to high school in the UK, it was still apparently socially acceptable for the teacher to take a piece of chalk and send it whistling down into the offending area. Apparently that's not okay anymore, but let's go with that analogy. The students would probably like to know who's going to be hit by that lump of chalk once it gets thrown. Okay, some of the teachers that I witnessed had fairly erratic arms. So how would I make a prediction for who's going to get hit by that lump of chalk? I'd need to know everything about how I released the piece of chalk, how fast my hand was moving, what the direction was. I'd need to kind of really measure all of the conditions that were present up to the point where I released the chalk. Then I could make a fairly accurate prediction of where it's going to go. Okay? And I would like to know precisely where it's going to land. That is an initial value problem. I need to know the initial state perfectly, or very well at least, to be able to make a useful prediction of where that chalk is going to go. Climate modeling is not so concerned with where that piece of chalk is going to go. The analogy for the boundary forcing, the climate problem, is a balloon attached to a fan, like a stand-up fan, that's on and blowing. So it's tethered to the fan by a piece of string. And as we, were to stand back and look at that balloon bobbing around on the piece of string in the fan, we wouldn't be able to predict with any degree of certainty very far in advance where that balloon is going to be at a particular time. But if we observed that balloon oscillating, moving around for long enough, we would get an idea of the space, the bounds in which the balloon was able to move, right? It wouldn't be able to go, any which way, as long as everything was held fixed, the length of the string, the speed of the fan, etc. So if we can build up a picture of the statistics of where that balloon, the positions that balloon has inhabited, then this is the climate, right? The blue ellipse on the screen represents the variability of the climate. We know the balloon can take positions anywhere inside that blue shape. So the boundary forcing problem in some ways is simpler than the weather forecasting or the initial value problem, because the initial conditions, where the balloon was when I switched on the fan or the very first second where I switched on, it doesn't really matter to our understanding of the space in which the balloon can move. As long as I observe that process for long enough and I get good statistics, then I have a good picture of the variation. Okay, I think I need to speed up a bit. Let's talk about how we can use these models. So this is a busy slide, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just to say that these climate models, as described, can be validated against observations. They can also be validated by running them under situations for which they were not really designed. Remember, these are numerical weather prediction models at heart. The physics has been described for the present climate, but we can run these models under paleoclimate conditions. We can run, and these experiments are done, and we can make these models simulate the climate of the last glacial maximum, or even further back at in the middle Pliocene or the Eocene, right? So there's periods of geological history for which we can configure our models and run them as a test bed, and if they're able to reproduce at least broadly the pattern of observations from proxy observations from those periods, then that's a good test. We can also use these models by just running them for a really long time, right? The observational data record we have from satellites is only 30, 35 years old. But we can run a climate model for 1,000 or more years. Just let it bounce around, let that balloon bounce around inside the ellipse and get a feel for what natural climate variability looks like. That's a really powerful use of climate models. And that's informing lots of our understanding about climate variation. We can run the models in this kind of forward mode where we subject the models to different emission scenarios, as I showed in my introduction. We can use them as laboratories, right, to do experiments like abruptly increasing CO2 by a factor of 2 or 4, right, overnight. What happens to the climate system? We can look at the response. We can induce volcanic eruptions that are the same size as Mount Pinatubo in 1991, or 10 times the size, right? What does the climate do over the years following that? It's really the only safe way to experiment on the climate system. Currently, we're conducting a pretty unsafe and uncontrolled experiment on the climate system outside. A climate model, I would argue, provides a very safe, reliable, and relatively fast, right? If you can simulate 100 years in a month, that's pretty quick, laboratory for conducting these experiments. Okay. Part 2, I'd like to make a brief story about improvements to these models. And it turns out that, as I said, most of the science that's being done toward improving climate models is in the parameterizations. So I'm going to tell you about one such process. I'm going to get kind of specific. Here's just a bit of motivation. So resolution has improved steadily in climate models since 1990. So the grid spacing was about 500 kilometers in 1990. 100 or nowadays 50 kilometers is about typical. So a dramatic improvement in resolution. Here's what numerical weather prediction, just for information really, has done. It's worth pointing out that the red line here, this is the skill, the accuracy of a 5-day prediction, so 5-day lead time, and this is the percentage of accurate forecasts, right? So a 5-day forecast, let's see how this works. So a 5-day forecast today is about the same as a 3-day forecast was in the sort of 80s and 90s, right? So we've really improved the reach of numerical weather prediction, and in the southern hemisphere in particular, for reasons that I don't have time to go into. But models are continuously improving, and partly that's due to resolution, but partly that's due to improvements in the physics too. So the story that I'm going to tell involves Earth's energy budget, and in particular it involves the shortwave or the sunlight portion of Earth's energy budget. So we have sunlight, incoming solar radiation here, and I'm going to focus in particular on the part down here. So some fraction of the incoming sunlight gets absorbed by the surface of the Earth and warms the Earth. We know that. That's good. That helps us all be here and the planet not to be too cold. But some fraction of it gets reflected back to space. Okay, so I'm going to zero in on that part, that the reflective part here. And we know that surfaces that are brighter, right, white, snow, ice, reflect more incoming solar radiation than darker surfaces, right? This is the technical term for reflectivity is albedo, and so high albedo surfaces reflect more sunlight. And there's a feedback loop that is involved with the albedo of different surfaces, known as the snow and ice albedo feedback, right? Because as we warm the climate system, we tend to melt snow and ice. And as we melt snow and ice, we tend to make the surface darker, right? We go from high albedo to lower albedo. And that results in more solar radiation being absorbed at the surface. And that results in more warming, which then melts more snow and ice, and the feedback loop continues, right? So this is a positive feedback mechanism that is pretty well known, pretty well understood to operate in a warming climate. It can also operate in reverse in a cooling climate too. But this is something that we expect. It's also something that we observe, and you can observe it by satellite. Here's an image from the MODIS satellite showing surface albedo for a very cold month. This is 1 year ago this month, February 2015. We all probably remember it. In this part of the world, it was very cold and snowy, not like today at all. So the surface albedo is shown here by brighter colors, whiter colors when it's high, and darker, bluer colors when it's low. So all of the area here in this month is covered with snow, right? This was a cold month. But when we look at the albedo, we see that high up in the Arctic up here, we see bright white, high albedo, as viewed from space, I should have said. That's the tundra, right? That we know is a fairly barren land, not much vegetation, bright white. Yeah, if you go there, you would need sunscreen, right? If you're doing field work up there, eye protection and sunscreen, right? It's a pretty bright and barren landscape. Similarly, in our part of the world, you know, where we have mainly deciduous forests viewed from above, that can, under snowy conditions, look pretty bright too from the air. And you'll see, it's a bit hard to make out, but there are brighter features in here. But there's this big band all the way through these sort of middle latitudes here, where albedos, even though there's snow on the ground, are very low. And these are forested areas, right? This is the boreal forest, coniferous, evergreen forested areas. So what you're seeing from space is not the surface, it's not the snow, mainly, it's the tops of the trees. If we fast forward through to May, this has gotten a little dark, but essentially what you'll see is that the snow's gone now, right? And so things have gotten a lot darker here in the deciduous forest areas. They've gotten a bit darker up here, but because it's May, there's still snow up north. But you've hardly seen any change, I would argue, in this boreal forest region, right? Because it was pretty dark to start with. The trees are still dark, even in May. So when you can't see the surface because there's vegetation in the way, the albedo of the surface doesn't really make a big difference. And if there's snow there or not, it doesn't make a big difference. So this can be really important, as I'll argue in a moment, for climate change and understanding climate change, both in these regions, but also outside of these regions too. So this was observational data. How do the models simulate this process? Well, it turns out they have some problems. And the areas with problems, this is just one climate model that we've studied. This is a figure from a paper by my PhD student, Chad Thackeray. And so he's shown in one model here, where you have red colors, it's showing you that this snow albedo feedback mechanism, the feedback loop, is not as strong in the model as it is in observations. So for every degree of warming in the observations, we're not getting as much darkening of the surface in the climate model, right? That's where the colors are red. And the green outline that I have on this figure here shows you where the boreal forest is in this data set. So we argue in the paper that there's a pretty good correspondence in most areas between where the biggest problems are in terms of representing this feedback and the presence of this evergreen forest. Okay? So the take-home from that is that the models have some issues simulating this feedback in the presence of evergreen forests. And this is a pretty well-known feature of climate models, that snow interacting with the vegetation canopy causes problems. It's not something that's very easy to parameterize, and this is the end result. Why do we care about this? Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because snow albedo feedback influences local temperatures, right? Where you have a stronger feedback, you have more warming. I'll also show you a figure in a moment that suggests not only is that warming effect local, but there can also be a non-local circulation change. The snow albedo feedback operates from winter to spring, as I've just described, but it also operates under climate change, right? There'll be less snow in April 2100 than there was in April 2000 because of warming. So what we can do is to use satellite data, similar to the data that I just showed you from MODIS, to estimate what the strength of this snow albedo feedback should be from observations, right? And then compare it to the different climate models that we have around the world. And so this seasonal cycle shows you what the value of this feedback strength should be in the present climate. This gray shaded region is the observed. Each of these numbers is a different climate model, similar to the dots that I had on the map earlier on. And you'll see that their estimates, their simulation of the feedback strength is pretty variable, right? Some of the models down here are very weak. Some of the models up here are very strong in terms of feedback. And there's only a very few that kind of cluster around where the observed value is. So that's one thing. The other thing is that from the models, but not, of course, from the observations, we can look at climate change, right? We can use those very same models for which we've got an estimate of the strength of this feedback loop under the seasonal cycle, under present climate, and we can say, well, how strongly do they simulate that feedback under climate change? And it turns out that those two quantities, the seasonal cycle and the climate change feedback strength, are very well correlated. You can see the slope of this line is pretty close to 1. There's a very strong relationship between those things. What that implies is that if we have models that cluster around the correct or the observed feedback strength in the present climate, those are the ones that we would expect to provide a good estimate of the feedback strength under climate change, right? So we can use observations of this process to try and constrain our future projections, for which obviously we have no observations. Doing that has advantages, as I mentioned. There's a very strong correlation between the strength of this feedback and the amount of warming that different models produce, particularly in spring and particularly over northern hemisphere lands where most of the snow exists. And that makes sense that the temperature response is strongest there. I've alluded to this result a couple of times, but our work from 2009 showed that models with a stronger snow albedo feedback, ones that produce more warming over the continental interiors, are also associated, as you'll see in these lower two panels, with a circulation response, so a wind response and a sea level pressure response out over the oceans, nowhere near where the snow albedo feedback is taking place. So we know that changes to the lower boundary, warming near the surface, can induce circulation responses far away, thousands of kilometers from where the temperature change is happening. And this was demonstrated in our work. So getting this feedback right and getting the seasonal cycle of albedo right is, I would argue, of high importance for the understanding of climate change. And so that brings me right to the end of this short story, which talks about model development. Because in the model that I showed you previously from Chad Thackeray's work, the reason it turned out that model was performing so poorly in terms of representing snow albedo feedback is because it had a very crude representation of how snow interacted with the forest canopy. So in the old version of the model, if the temperatures were below freezing, snow that fell onto the forest canopy would stay there. And it would stay there indefinitely until the temperature rose above freezing again. And all of the precipitation that fell onto the forest canopy was deemed to be in a single phase. So if the temperature was below freezing, it was all snow. And then as soon as the temperature went above freezing, it immediately converted all to water and fell down to the surface. So as soon as the temperature went above freezing, all of the snow melted instantaneously and was gone. So you've gone from a situation where your albedo is very high because the snow is just sticking to the forest canopy, which in reality it doesn't. If you go out into a coniferous forest a day or two after a snowstorm, most of the snow is probably blown off or fallen to the surface, or some of it sublimated. So this was highly idealized, too simplistic. So a model improvement was made. A group at Michigan and now at Rutgers were responsible for introducing an improved parameterization for how snow interacts with the forest canopy. And so now we have different buckets for snow and for liquid precipitation, and the switch that removes all snow when the temperature nudges above freezing has been relaxed a bit, so there's a more gradual change. Anyway, the point is that we can track these improvements, and we know that these improvements should have knock-on effects for improving our understanding of climate change. I'm going to demonstrate that in one simple figure here, which shows the older versions of the model. So for example, the purple, the green, and the blue lines here. This is the seasonal cycle going from September, October, all the way through to May, June. So this is the snow season through the winter. This shows you the change in the surface albedo over the boreal forest region in these different models. And so the albedo is increasing during the autumn as snow begins to accumulate. And then as you move into mid to late winter, it starts to decrease again. The observations are shown in red. And in the old versions of the model, the albedo would start to decrease over these forest areas 2 months earlier than it did in the observations. And this is a direct result of those oversimplified parameterizations that I mentioned before. In the new version of the model, there's been an improvement. It's not perfect, right? The yellow line is the new version of the model. It doesn't perfectly overlay the red line. We know that there's still work to do here. But it's an improvement. There's definitely an improved seasonal cycle in this model. And we continue to investigate this problem and to look at this model and this improvement to see whether the knock-on effects on our understanding of surface temperature change and of circulation can also be observed. So this is not a complete story by any means, but it shows you that the science that's being done and is being presented in the usual peer-reviewed literature is geared towards understanding climate science and climate processes and variability, but it's also geared towards improving models. Those two things are intrinsically linked because climate models, are so important in terms of understanding both past climate and making projections for future climate. Okay, so with that, I would like to conclude. I'd like to thank the members of my research group, in particular Chad Thackeray, who presented work for this talk, funding agencies, in particular NSERC. Compute Canada provides us with great computing resources. Model developers all around the world, you saw the dots on the image, are providing model code in many cases and data. And I would like to thank you, the audience, for your attention. So thank you very much.